Hello, little Vickies. Welcome back to my channel. Tonight, I'll be sharing 7 paranormal stories that are allegedly true. If you like what you hear, please subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the like button as it's incredibly helpful to my growth here on YouTube. If you have a suggestion or simply want to say hello, please leave a comment. I always reply. I upload every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday by 5 p.m. Pacific. If you have a story of your own you'd like to share and possibly have read on the channel, send it to me at veronica45stories@gmail.com. Thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it more than I can say. Now it's time to relax and get on with the stories. I used to be a hostler for public transport, cleaned and fueled city buses at night, while I went to school in the day. There was one route that drove around 20 miles on the freeway out to the country where the bus could cruise at 65 miles per hour. Drivers loved it because it got them out of the city driving, so often a senior driver took the route. One evening in late spring, making its final run, a car cut the bus off to make an exit from the left lane, clipped the bus's front bumper, caused the driver to slam on the brakes, which locked up. A 40-foot bus going that fast. It was amazing the driver kept it on the highway and upright. The driver was physically unhurt. A few other riders suffered bad bumps and bruises from being thrown forward in their seats. Unfortunately, there was also a fatality. A young woman, 7 to 8 months pregnant, was at the back of the bus, and despite the warning not to stand when on the freeway, she was uncomfortable and preferred to. When the accident happened, she was thrown half the length of the bus, landing on her stomach. Sadly, she hemorrhaged and died before the sheriff or paramedics arrived. Her unborn child wasn't saved. I was brought to the accident about 3 hours after it occurred, not knowing the details, to bring the bus back to the garage. The driver was gone, and the sheriff had finished his work and told me what had happened. I drove alone, followed by my supervisor, in an empty bus with a floor covered with blood and cat litter, which we used to keep messes from spreading, and it wasn't the first time I'd seen such gore. Getting back to the garage, I cleaned and sanitized the bus. It took hours. I finished around 1 a.m., and coming back into the shop, the director, the head of fleet, and my shop steward were waiting. I found out officially the story of what happened, that the driver had a breakdown after learning of the death, and they wanted to keep it quiet. It was a terrible situation for everyone, and they didn't want others to know. I, of course, agreed. My last task was to park the bus in the back lot, no service, pending repairs. I dropped the clipboard for bus 571 at the desk. Over the next few weeks, a few of the details were known by everyone, but not about the victim being pregnant. The driver was so broken by what happened, he retired. The bus was repaired and back in service, and the car driver who caused the accident had been arrested. That night, I was on the fuel pumps as the fleet came in. One of the last buses to return was the college shuttle, the least desirable route, as it was basically the drunk bus for kids going back to campus from the bars. A newer driver was at the wheel. When I greeted him, he was clearly upset and actually jumped off the bus. At the last stop, to ensure everyone is off the bus, he was supposed to walk front to back and then back to his seat to make sure no one is trying to stay on. Most drivers just check their mirrors. He said he walked the bus, saw no one, then locked the doors and went out of service. About 5 minutes later, driving down the street, he looked in his mirror and saw a girl standing in the back of the bus. Still driving, he told her she needed to get off and pulled to the next stop. He pulled over, spun around, and the bus was empty. The driver mentioned he was worried because the girl looked rough and was white as a sheet. He asked me to check again because he couldn't believe he'd imagined it. The bus was empty, and after a few minutes of talking, he walked in and I started fueling the bus. It was then I noticed it was 571. The first time I'd seen it since the night of the accident, but didn't think anything of it. Once fueled and washed, I parked it on a different route and went on with my duties. Being 22, I was at the bottom of seniority, which meant my schedule sucked. I always got Sunday off, but my other day usually was a Tuesday or Thursday. That following Friday, I came in around 5 p.m. My shift was 5 to 2 a.m., and the senior guys were already there talking to our supervisor. Seemed the night before, someone had snuck into the garage. The guys heard someone, but never found them. They didn't call the cops, which upset our supervisor because, as this was right at the start of the meth epidemic, druggies would try to steal tools or supplies. The lead senior said they started hearing a girl crying just before the end of the night, but couldn't find her because it seemed like she was moving. When it did stop, he figured she was a scared kid trying to get away from something. Over the next month, similar incidents happened. I only heard it once, but it was screaming, not crying, and others just assumed it was a punk kid and turned the music up. The garage parked 35 buses with windows at the top, and most assumed it was someone outside and the noise carried. By this time, a few other drivers had stories of seeing the sick girl on their bus, but different routes. All were driving bus 571. One driver came to the fuel pumps asking us to call a paramedic and police. He'd seen a new mom holding a child wrapped up, and the mom looked pale. He thought she'd got off one of the last stops, but didn't see which one. Police drove the route, but never found anyone. Eventually, a connection was made to the crash and the happenings. Suddenly, the sightings increased and became more fantastic. Drivers started talking about seeing her fly. A mechanic claimed oil came out as blood during a change. Even a few of the hostlers claimed they saw her pacing on the bus. If you listened, everyone described her differently, and it was clear a lot of people just wanted to be part of it. It became a distraction to the point drivers refused the bus when assigned, claiming mechanical issues. Eventually, it was pulled from rotation and placed on standby, so if a bus broke down en route, it would be used and was left parked at the main station. The summer passed and people moved on. In August, before the college started again, half the fleet was updated, and being one for bureaucratic spending, all buses were renumbered as the diesel fleet became 400 and the new hybrid vehicles were 300, supposedly because the director wanted them to rhyme with electricity. Almost immediately, people started hearing the crying at night, and drivers started seeing things on bus 442. We hostlers could tell 442 was 571 by the service clipboard, and the front end was newly painted. After another week and people connecting the dots, 442 was put on reserve. Eventually, it ended up being sold to the police as their drunk bus to break up parties. About a year later, right when I was quitting to go back for my master's, the cops came by to fuel up before the first weekend when students arrived. The cop driving, standing at the pumps, got to talking, and he mentioned how he hates this effing bus, gives me the creeps. I didn't ask why, and he didn't share. Like I've been saying in previous posts, being part of the medical community has afforded me the chance to evaluate patterns in all stages of life of people, including patterns that we see at the end of life. Some of you that work in hospitals or have loved ones that work in hospitals or have been close to loved ones as they took their last breaths and transitioned to the great unknown may have heard of what I'm about to describe. There's a particular phenomenon that occurs to people in those last moments, and I'm talking about the appearance of kids running about around their deathbed or just outside of their room. This is to be differentiated to the phenomenon of close ones that have passed away visiting in days prior to their deaths. This is different. This occurs hours, if not minutes, before their deaths. I experience this with greater frequency whenever I work in the ICU unit where people are very sick. What most patients describe is cheerful kids running about around their beds in a playful manner, snickering around or just playing. Most patients usually respond calling the nurse and asking, "Who are these kids running around and where are their parents?" and scaring the living bejesus out of them if they are new nurses. If they are experienced nurses, they know the time of the end is soon to come, and they communicate promptly with us doctors to let us know to be ready. Literature often chalks this phenomenon up to lack of oxygen in the brain or neurochemical changes in the process of death and dying. But the pattern is very recognizable, and the experience is very similar across all cultural backgrounds and ages. Almost all hospitals have a story about these kids, and if you are entering the field of medicine, nursing, or any other health-allied profession, you will certainly hear these stories. So if you are doing rounds in the ICU late at night and hear some snickering or tiny feet running in the hallways, be prepared, because the call of a code green or code red is about to sound off in the PA system. For as long as I've known my wife, she's mentioned growing up in a haunted house. I always assumed she was joking because she always brought it up in quite a light-hearted way and never went into much detail. It was a big old house, and I figured she was talking about weird old house noises. The house belonged to her great-aunt, who raised my wife for most of her childhood. Her great-aunt recently passed away, and her great-aunt's daughter, whom my wife calls her aunt, though technically she's her second cousin or something, I'll be referring to her as her aunt, now owns the house. After my wife's great-aunt passed, we went to stay in the house for 4 nights to attend the funeral and spend time with my wife's family, as we lived in another state. When we got there, my wife and her aunt were chatting and mentioned that they thought my wife's great-aunt might join the ghosts already haunting the house. I still didn't consider that they might be serious. The first night we spent there, I woke up in the middle of the night and noticed someone standing in the corner of the room beside the door. Thinking it was my wife, I asked what she was doing. This woke up my wife, who was actually sleeping beside me. I said I thought I saw someone in the room with us, but it must just be my eyes playing tricks on me. She said, "The person in the corner next to the door? Yeah, don't worry about it." I almost pissed myself. I thought there was some creep in the room, and my wife was too sleepy to process it. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but when my phone lit up the room, I saw there was no one there. There wasn't even a weird shape that I might have mistaken for a person. The door was closed, so it wasn't like there could have been someone there who left the room in the moments I was looking away to grab my phone. My wife told me it was common to see shadowy people in the night, but I shouldn't worry because they don't do anything. She fell back asleep right after that, but I just lay there awake the whole night wondering what the hell had just happened. The next morning I asked my wife about it, and she said she wasn't kidding about the house being haunted. People who spend the night in the house regularly see and hear ghosts, but they've never hurt anyone or caused any problems. I remained skeptical even after the next night, which had been after the funeral, and my wife and aunt both reported they'd been visited in their dreams by my wife's great-aunt. So far, in my mind, everything was weird but explainable, The figure in the room could have been a strange trick of the light. My wife and her aunt had just attended the funeral of their loved one, and it made sense for them to both dream about her that night. The third night, I was kept awake for hours by the constant sound of footsteps pacing around the house. My wife also heard them, but said it was normal and I shouldn't worry, and she fell asleep easily. A few times during the night, I got up to look around for the source of the noise. I even did a couple of laps of the outside of the house in case there was someone outside. I never saw anyone walking around. At one point, I was in the lounge room and heard footsteps from the kitchen and called out to ask if there was anyone there. My wife's aunt opened her bedroom door and said she could hear the footsteps too, and just like my wife, she told me it was normal and there was no cause for concern. Then there was the sound of a drawer opening in the kitchen, which we both reacted to, and I went to check and found the cutlery drawer open. My wife's aunt, who'd come to the kitchen too, simply closed the drawer, commented with mild annoyance that the ghosts are always leaving things open, and went back to bed, leaving me to my existential crisis. I could not come up with a way to explain that. We'd both heard the footsteps, both heard the drawer open at the same time, and there was no one there and no way out of the kitchen except for past us. I tried staying on the couch to try and catch the mystery walker, and there was multiple times I heard the footsteps pass through the lounge room, but I never saw anything. Eventually I gave up and went back to bed. Nothing really happened the final night, though we woke up to several cabinets open and no one remembered leaving them open, though that could be explainable by someone just forgetting, or even sleepwalking. Even so, the footsteps still bothered me, and the shadowy person from the first night and cabinets opened on the final night made me nervous in light of everything that happened on the third night. Up until now, I've always scoffed at the idea of the paranormal, but I just can't reconcile my experiences in that house with my skepticism. Talking to my wife's family revealed that everyone who stayed in the house believes it's haunted because they've had at least one completely unexplainable experience there. They all report that the ghosts leave people alone for the most part, though some who lived there for a long time as children, including my wife and her aunt, have described meeting people they thought were probably ghosts and having positive but strange interactions with them. This happened when I was 12 years old. I'm now 45. My family is from the Midwest, and I live in California, so when my Uncle Bernie died, we all flew back to South Dakota for the funeral. Bernie was the best guy you could ever imagine. Kind, generous, hardworking, compassionate, funny, and he had a wife and 3 great kids. He died of a heart attack unexpectedly, but he was everyone's favorite uncle, son, brother, cousin, and everyone was therefore devastated from his passing. We went to the funeral, and it was fine, and that night we all stayed in my grandparents' house, a huge house with many bedrooms. I was staying in my own room, but got scared in the early night, so I went to snuggle in with my mom and dad in their room. My grandparents have had sleigh bells on their front door for as long as I can remember to alert them whenever someone opened or closed the door. We were all fast asleep a little after 3 a.m. when the loud jingle of the sleigh bells woke us up. Then we felt a freezing cold wind through our room that fluttered the curtains. We got up and ran out to the hallway where we met with a bunch of sleepy guests, all having been awoken, including my grandpa, who said, "It's okay. It's just Uncle Bernie coming to say goodbye." Then the bells jingled again softly, and I began to cry. We all went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I was glad to get on the plane the next day to go back home. So I've been back and forth on whether or not to tell this story. mostly because it involves some aspects of my working life that I'm not at liberty to discuss, but also because it had severe personal implications for me. Anyway, I've decided to share it here, and I hope you understand why there are things I simply can't go into detail about. This all started in December 2020. As part of my education, I was scheduled for a 6-month internship at a psychiatric hospital. I had previous experience with working with these type of patients, so I was really excited about it. I switched around the 4 different wards in the hospital, so I treated a lot of different people with lots of different problems. I was curious about all the different aspects, so I never said no to a task, which meant I came across everything from murderers and pedophiles to suicidal teenagers with personality disorders. In my work life, I've had people spit at me, verbally and physically assault me, throw shit at me, and all that stuff. So I think I'm a pretty tough guy. And besides that, I always carried a personal assault alarm. One press of a button and staff from every ward would be there in a matter of seconds. On one of the wards, I quickly noticed that there was a certain room which was monitored 24/7 by a guard. To be clear, this is a pretty normal procedure, either because the patient is physically abusive, suicidal, or restrained. But most patients get the watch pulled off them relatively quickly. I asked a colleague, and she told me it was a female patient, let's just call her Anne, who was extremely aggressive and psychotic beyond belief. At that point, Anne had been restrained to her bed for 3 months. I could not believe what I was hearing. We have really strict procedures when it comes to restraining people with belts. By the way, they're soft belts made of fabric, not leather. So restraining the patient is really the absolutely last resort we go to. I asked the chief psychiatrist what was up with this girl, and he just scoffed and said, "If I only knew, but honestly, she defies logic." He told me that at first they thought she was psychotic, but her symptoms only got worse no matter how much different medication they tried. Then they thought she might have suffered a trauma and was in a dissociative state. But that still didn't fit the profile of her symptoms. She had gone from being a perfectly normal woman in her 20s to being violent, extremely aggressive, and unable to speak in just 4 months. That is practically unheard of, especially as no drugs were involved. We regularly make a toxicology check of all patients, and always when they're admitted. One day my alarm went off. They're all connected, so I know where I need to run to help my colleagues. I immediately knew it had to be Anne, and I was right. She had only her legs and torso fixated. Again, normal procedure if the patient otherwise is relatively calm. She had defecated in her hand and thrown it at the guard watching her. She then proceeded to bite her fingers so hard that 3 or 4 of them had really bad fractures. Both her hands were a bloody mess, and she needed like 50 stitches afterwards. It wasn't the blood or the fact that she would throw her filth at us. I had seen that loads of times, but the screams this woman made. It was the most primal, guttural, and terrifying sound I have ever heard. It scared me shitless. The best way I can describe it is something like a bear growling and a mountain lion hissing and spitting at the same time. I have seen my fair share of people in primal distress, but I could have never imagined that a person could make a sound like that. As an intern, I am in no way allowed to use force, so I was just watching as 7 of my colleagues tried to fixate her fully to her bed. They had serious trouble pinning her down. Remind you, these are really experienced people. At last, we called a medicinal alarm, which immediately calls for a chief psychiatrist to make decisions. He decided to forcefully medicate her. They gave her 1 and then a 2nd shot, and it only seemed to piss her off, even though it should have put a bear to sleep. At the 3rd injection, she calmed enough so that they could restrain her. She never nodded off. She just breathed heavily and kept staring up at the same corner of the room, sometimes smirking at something only she could see. Fast forward 2 weeks. I was back at the ward. It was a relatively calm weekend, so there really wasn't much to do. Anne was in one of her good periods, so she had had her restraints removed. A guard was always by her, though. I was sitting in the office when suddenly I see Anne walking in the hallway without the guard. I don't know if he had taken a bathroom break or whatever, but he wasn't around. So I caught up with her and I asked her what she was doing in the hallway alone, but of course she didn't respond. I should mention that many of my colleagues were afraid of Anne, and rightfully so, even though everyone is aware that it's the illness and not the person attacking you. But when it keeps happening, that patient does catch some stigma. I, for one, always try to look at the person and not the illness, so I asked where we were going. She took me by the arm and led me to the common area. She went over to a book cabinet, turned, and looked at me and muttered, "Read, book." I was completely taken aback by the fact that she was speaking. She pulled out a random book and handed it to me. She then sat down on the floor and started rocking back and forth. I joined her on the floor and started reading the book. It was just some random old book, probably from a charity, and it had no special meaning. But as I read, she came closer and closer to me. She then cuddled up to me, put her head on my lap, and fell asleep. One of my colleagues came by, and she looked absolutely shocked. And before I knew it, 5 or 6 people, including the chief psychiatrist, were looking at me reading this random book out to her. I caught a lot of praise for this, which is always nice. But then, things took a turn for the worse, for me at least. It started one night when I was home alone. It was a completely normal night for me until I heard something from upstairs coming down. The best way to describe it is like a big dog thrashing and tumbling down the stairs. You know, like when a dog rushes down the stairs to greet you? But this was bigger, much bigger. I could hear the weight of something tumbling down while nails or claws or whatever slid on the steps. I got up thinking that somehow there was a massive animal in my house, but there was nothing there. That scared the ever-living shit out of me. I had never had anything like that happen. I left the house and stayed the night with my parents. But I also had strange effects on my body, like I had a filter over my eyes or something. Everything started to seem out of focus, like tunnel vision, but with a massive blur added to it. And then I started to dissociate. I had this feeling of being totally out of contact with my body. Then came the panic attacks. My girlfriend called an ambulance one of the times because I was on the verge of a heart attack. The paramedic said I had a heart rate of 240 beats per minute. I've had no prior problems with my psyche, but I figured it was stress. I've suffered from sleep paralysis before, but never with hallucinations or whatever you want to call it. But that started recently. I see a large black mass with long arms and legs sitting on top of the corner of our bedroom, like a massive spider, but just with 4 legs. This is now happening on a nightly basis. A couple of days ago, I told my girlfriend about it because she kept pestering me with questions about my nightmares. She said, "That's funny. Every time you're just about to go to sleep, you look up in that corner and you sort of smirk." That reminded me of Anne. And now I am absolutely terrified that I might have brought something home. Believe it or not, that's up to you. I have never treated a patient like Anne, and none of my colleagues had either. It was scary stuff. And I have never suffered any psychological problems before. Never. But something is going on. I'm sure of it. It feels like it wants to get back at me or something. I don't know. And by the way, Anne is much better today. She is in a rehabilitation home where she thrives. One day she might even be able to have her normal life back. This was a while back, but it still bothers me to this day. It was 2016, and me, 22, and my husband, 28, were moving into a rental home. I was 6 months pregnant, and we were thrilled to move into a nice community since before we had lived in a sketchy part of town. We didn't know much about this rental except it was in a good school district, low crime area, and within our budget. Time passes without any problems, and soon our son was born. His birth was textbook, and he slept well in the hospital. This all changed when we brought him home. The first night home was awful. Every time we set him in his crib, he screamed. I'm not talking a normal, I'm hungry or need a new diaper cry, a legitimate scream like he was in pain. My husband and I had to take shifts at night, so one could be with him and the other could sleep. My shift was always second and started around 2 to 3 in the morning. I tried my best to sleep, but shortly after my son's birth, I began having horrible nightmares. I would dream nightly about my son being hurt or needing me, and I couldn't get to him. At my 6-week checkup, I told my OB/GYN, and she believed I was having postpartum anxiety and prescribed me medicine and recommended I see a counselor. Weeks passed by since starting the medicine and counseling, and I was still having nightmares, and my son was still screaming all night long. His pediatrician told us it was colic and that we just needed to wait it out. Everything changed when he turned 3 months old. His screaming continued, but started to be all day instead of just at night. My nightmares became much more specific. One night I dreamed that I walked into my son's room and he was on fire and screaming. Though I was in his room, my feet were stuck inside his doorway. I couldn't move or speak. I could only watch my son screaming in pain. I woke up screaming and hyperventilating. My husband ran into our room and tried to console me. The next few nights I could not sleep. I spent most of my days at work and my evenings sitting on my front porch talking to my next-door neighbor. She was the sweetest old lady who had lived in this neighborhood since it was originally built in the 70s. I guess she could tell me something was wrong and ask me if I was okay. Reluctantly, I told her how my baby had been acting and how I was having horrible nightmares. She was sympathetic and asked me to elaborate. I didn't feel comfortable telling her the details, so I just told her I had dreams about fires in the house. Her face quickly changed from caring and concern to horrified. Seconds of quiet felt like hours before she spoke again. "Do you know what happened at this house?" she said. I told her no. She sighed and looked down before grabbing my hands and looking at me. She goes on to tell me that a few years ago there was a fire at the house due to some faulty wiring done poorly by the landlord. There was a young family with a 3-month-old baby living there, and unfortunately the baby passed away in the fire. She said the couple moved away and the house was renovated and put up for rent after. I was in shock. I ran inside to my husband holding our baby and told him we needed to leave. He must have seen the fear in my eyes since he did not ask me to explain myself until we had got in the car. I explained what happened in the house and how I felt like my dreams were warnings that we needed to leave before something happened to our baby. Luckily, my brother-in-law lived in the next town over, so we went there. The first night we stayed in his house, our son slept through the night. Not a single peep. I checked on him every hour since it was so unusual for him to sleep this well. From then on, apart from the normal baby stuff, my son never screamed again like he did in that house. My husband packed our stuff and we stayed with my brother-in-law until we were able to get out of our lease and rent a new place. I never went back. I will never go back. I just pray for whoever moved in there next. My name is Charles. In college, I met an incredible woman and fell in love. After many awkward encounters and clumsy dates, we finally formed a solid relationship and ended up getting married soon after college. We moved in together, got our first serious jobs, and life was going really well for us. We had both been from fairly small families, and we had long talked about having a large family together, and soon after getting married started trying to grow our family. We had trouble at first, but we were young, and we told ourselves that we had tons of time. Several years later, we were still trying, and that was by far the most difficult part of our marriage. But as a whole, we were still strong together and definitely still loved each other deeply. My wife had gone to school to be a nurse, and early into our 7th year of marriage, she finished going back to school to be a nurse practitioner. She found a new job in a town we were both really excited about moving to across the state, so we packed up and moved our things. My job allowed me to move essentially anywhere, so we were definitely going to take this opportunity for her and for our small family. One night, not long after we moved into our new home, boxes still half emptied in many rooms, I started wondering why my wife hadn't returned home yet. Sometimes she got calls right before she was about to leave the hospital, so I certainly wasn't a stranger to late nights and dinner alone. But this night was taking especially long. Not only that, and this might just be me looking back into the event after the fact, but the longer I waited, the more I felt like something wasn't right. I had been texting and calling my wife on and off for a while as well, and unlike her, she wasn't responding at all. After a while, right before I was about to call the hospital to check and see if she was still at work, my phone rang with an unknown number. Thinking that maybe she had stayed at work late and her phone had died, I answered. It was a man on the other end with a professional-sounding voice that immediately made me nervous. He told me that he was calling from the local sheriff's office, that there had been an accident, and that I needed to get to the main hospital downtown. I barely heard the words. I understood him, but it was honestly like the sheriff was speaking to me underwater. Nonetheless, in a panic, as you might imagine, I rushed to the hospital. After speaking with the staff there, to my horror, I was no longer there to talk to my wife. I was no longer even there to hold her hand as she struggled with a ventilator or clung to life courageously. Though she had been the strongest woman I had ever known, the crash and the injuries she had sustained were too much even for her. She had died on the way to the hospital. Later I learned that as she drove through the rain that night, a deer had run in front of the car. She had swerved to miss the deer, clipped it, and her car had ended up in a fair-sized gully off the side of the road. She had smashed into a tree at the bottom of the deep ditch. After the funeral, I never really felt alone for a few weeks. My family and even a few friends from where we had used to live checked on me constantly for a while, making sure I was making it okay, making sure I was getting out of bed and eating. But after a while, the visits got less and less as everyone returned to their regular lives. Yet for some reason, I always felt two ways at once, especially in the home we had started to unpack in together, the home that was still only partially unpacked in. I felt deeply, terribly alone, lost at sea without the one who had always been by my side since college. But at the same time, strangely, I continued to never feel alone. Yet this was different than the feeling of friends and family in the house. Their visits felt like space was being taken up, like mass and matter was in the house. This, now that I was alone, felt like a presence, but like the presence of wind or shadow or whispers. I know I haven't explained it well, but in the several years since, I have never been able to explain it well. I've tried many times, but I have never been able to put into words the feeling in that house, the alone and not alone at the same time. Yet even for me, life went on, but the presence continued, and the longer it continued, the more uneasy it tended to make me. You might think that the longer this feeling, this sensation went on, the more used to it I got, but that was not the case. The more it happened, the more unnatural the feelings got. There were times I began to feel almost paranoid about the saturated emptiness of the house. It was like the wrong vibration would grip me, like some deep, sickly, sickening feeling of a terrible drumbeat not resonating properly in my bones. And although I continued to work, often more and more to distract myself, my work was often done at home, and thus escaping the feeling became harder and harder. And you might think that I should have just left the house and worked in the local coffee shop or something, and thinking objectively, I would agree. But I was depressed and deeply attached to the half-decorated home, and leaving the house, even to run errands, felt almost like a betrayal to me. But that was not all that happened. As weeks turned into months after her death, there was more than a faint feeling of a shadow around the house. Things, small things here and there, began to happen, or at least I finally began to notice them, perhaps at last slowly coming out of the fog I had been in. For instance, I would put dish towels on the bar on the outside of the oven, go upstairs and come back down, and one would be on the kitchen counter. Or I would leave the light on in a particular room and return later and the light would be off. Sometimes, especially when I was downstairs, I felt like I could hear some of the partially open boxes being moved upstairs. It was almost like they were being opened and the contents were being placed upon the floor and moved around the room. But whenever I went to check, the boxes were almost always exactly as I had left them. Occasionally, an item would be sitting by the box on the floor, but I would put it back into the box, confused and unready still to unpack those items that reminded me so much of our old life together. Things in the house and within me stayed very similar for months and eventually years. As I approached 2 years since the accident, much of me had never moved on, but the time did heal some things, perhaps because of the first signs of healing, or perhaps because of the bitter loneliness. I finally agreed to meet a woman that a friend of mine had introduced me to. Though I had developed very few friendships in my new home, there were some who checked on me, inviting me occasionally to do things to keep me preoccupied. One of those friends had for several months hinted that I should go on a date with a woman he knew, but I couldn't bring myself to accept. Finally, though, I felt I was ready, or at least ready enough, and agreed to meet with her. We met at a local coffee shop. That was about all I could handle still, but the meeting was nice. Having another person to connect with on at least some personal level brought a bit of warmth back to me. Yet that night was a difficult night. I returned home early in the evening, watched some show to relax, then went to bed. Since my wife's death, I had never slept well. I had tried over-the-counter sleeping aids, different types of teas, listening to music, and several other things, and yet sleep often did not come to me until late into the night. Thankfully, my job did not require me to get up early, and even when I did fall asleep, it was often fretful and sleepless. Though I had been a deep sleeper since I was a kid, I now tossed and turned in the night, often waking up cold or sweating or jolting awake from some gripping fantasy or terrible nightmare. This night was no different. Though I had trouble falling asleep, finally, at last, I did drift into a shallow sleep. I have never known for sure if this occurred while I was awake or if it was simply a dream that I have translated into reality. It felt terrible, horribly real, and the evidence, as I will explain, remained. Yet for all its gripping realness, it also felt like a living nightmare. Sometime in the night I awoke, or so I believe, out of the near quiet, save the scarce sounds of the neighborhood, to a piercing scream from somewhere on the first floor of the house. The wail tore through my house like a terrible bolt of lightning, setting the hairs on my body instantly rigid. And though the presence of the house had long left me uneasy, this immediately left me terrified. But I had to check. So, not wanting to enter the darkness of any room as I approached the next light switch, I took a flashlight out of my nightstand beside the bed and crept from my room, hurrying to each light switch along the way. I flashed my light down the stairs, straining my ears, and still heard nothing. There was an empty, horrible silence after the screech. I finally reached the first floor, went through the foyer by the front door, and shined my light through the kitchen into the small dining room beyond. There, as my light fell into the room, shrouded in darkness, bent and crooked and horrible behind the dining room table, was a figure. Just for a moment the flashlight illuminated it. Just for a moment it seemed frozen in the glow of the light, and just as quickly as I had seen it, there was nothing behind the table, and my flashlight was illuminating the wall beyond. And yet, in that moment, it had been there, cruel and terrible somehow in that one moment, contorted beyond reason. I cannot say what it was. I cannot even say for sure that it was. With the little strength I had, I crept to the table, heart pounding, shining my light ridiculously furiously around each corner and into each nook of the darkness. I reached the table where it had been, and there, in the center of the table, was a picture. I shined my light on it, and immediately I could tell that it was dusty, taken, I would imagine, from one of the boxes I had yet to fully unpack. Unable and unwilling to examine it further there, I hurried back up the stairs, locked the door to the bedroom, and wiped off the picture frame. There, to my disbelief, was a picture of me and my wife, taken not long into our marriage, smiling. Yet down the center of the frame, the glass had been cracked, not smoothly, but roughly, almost as if the heel of a shoe had pressed down on it and sent fissures along the glass. Nonetheless, beyond the fissures, I could see us smiling. From that day on, the presence was more noticeable in the house. Nothing was as bad as that night, but more and more noises came from within the house. More and more things moved where they shouldn't be. Soon after the date, the woman reached out to me to see when we might meet again. I put it off for a while, though I had enjoyed our time together. That night had made me nervous. Yet eventually I agreed to meet again. We met and got dinner together, and I went home, happy at the meeting, but apprehensive. That night, sleep came surprisingly easy to me. It was not a deep sleep, but I was tired, and this was a rare night when the tiredness carried me to sleep quickly. At some point in the night I woke up. I didn't bolt awake, but woke up simply like I often did in the night. While I laid there, waiting to go back to sleep, a car must have driven down the road. Because of the position of the house near a slight hill, when cars drove down a particular road, the light from their headlights would shine dimly through one of the windows in the room. As I listened to the soft sound of the car and watched as the soft light fell into the room, there where the wall meets the ceiling was that horrible figure, that crooked shadow, bent and contorted, clinging somehow to the wall and the ceiling. For a moment my mind thought that this must be some trick of light and shadow on the ceiling, and yet before the light faded the figure crawled unnaturally and inhumanly into the ceiling and across it toward the bed. And then there was darkness and that terrible scream, so much louder than I had heard it before, from directly above me in the near total darkness. Utterly terrified, I grabbed furiously for my flashlight, turned it on, and shone the light at the ceiling and around each corner of the room. Nothing was there. No figure, no shadow, no presence. I did not sleep that night. I turned the lights on and tried to distract myself with my phone for most of the night, yet I could still feel something was there. Though I could see nothing, though there were no more screams, I could feel something. In the following months, things continued to progress. I had no more encounters like that, but the small occurrences got more routine and worse. Instead of only distant noises and small things being moved, I would occasionally see shadows, usually for just a moment, or hear faint words, always unintelligible, almost as if whispered to me. Yet I still wasn't sure if any of it was real, or if I was causing it, imagining it, if my grief and my loneliness were causing it. And in those months I came up with many reasons not to see that woman again. I liked her, but I had a terrible feeling after seeing her. The shadow, or my imagination and guilt, could not handle those meetings, innocent as they were. After many months still, I finally decided that there was no reason for me to be in that city anymore. I had moved there to start a new chapter in our family, but the story had ended there. There would never be another chapter there. There never could be. So finally, after painstakingly considering, I sold my home, bought a small house in the town I had grown up in, and moved our things. Actually, I have not been in the new house long. Despite that, in just a few weeks, I have unpacked more in this house than I ever did in all the years I was in the last house. This house does not hold the same weight, the same memories. So far, all has been well here. I have even started to sleep a little better, though not exactly well. The real test, perhaps, will be going on another date. I haven't brought myself to that yet. Perhaps someday I will. I think I would like to. I think my wife would have liked me to move on. I think. Still, I don't know what was in that house or within me. I know much of it sounds like perhaps it was my wife, her spirit, if there is such a thing. Yet my wife was such a loving, caring person in life. It's hard for me to believe that some part of her could devolve to such a state. Yet it is no longer hard for me to believe in such things. I had long not believed. My wife actually loved to learn about paranormal things, loved to read books about such things, watch shows, listen to podcasts, even occasionally this one. She's how I heard about you two in the first place and why I still listen to you now. Now, after everything, I believe in the possibility of things happening beyond normal reality, normal existence. But I do not know what this particular reality was. Perhaps it was my wife, or some part or version or shadow of my wife, contorted by the tragedy of her death. Perhaps it was an imprint of the tragedy itself, made manifest in the halls and rooms of the house. Perhaps it was some figment or shadow of my own mind, projected before me, the cruel and terrible embodiment of guilt and loss and betrayal. Perhaps it was something else, masquerading as the dark shadow of my wife, preying on me in my isolation and loneliness in the empty corners of our house. Perhaps still it is something else entirely. I do not know, and I do not think I ever will. Thank you all for making it all the way through my story. It means a lot to me that you would listen through the entire thing. I know it's kind of long. Please let me know if you have any thoughts or theories about any of this. It continues to baffle me to this day. Hello again, little Vickies. Thanks so much for listening. Remember, if you have a story of your own you'd like to share, send it to me at veronica45stories@gmail.com. Until next time, be good.